The Gospel Tabernacle in Chicago was a cowboy church from the get-go, and it produced.
Why doesn't it exist anymore?
Because Paul Rader's not there. The Chicago Gospel Tabernacle could not exist without Paul Rader. You cannot do a Chicago Gospel Tabernacle today unless you have another Paul Rader. The Chicago Gospel Tabernacle was Paul Rader. And Paul Rader was the Chicago Gospel Tabernacle. He has impacted me. Of course, I didn't know him. I think he died in, 1939. And, I was a long ways off from there. But how he has impacted me is a passion to reach people at all cost. You don't have to be a big name, I guess, I want to say. But the essence of ministry is impacting the lives of people. And once I'm going, it doesn't matter if people remember my name. But what does matter is this: do they remember the work that was done in their heart through my ministry? A lot of people come away from Paul Rader. His name isn't known today. And yet, much of what we have today in Christendom, as far as evangelism and missions is concerned, has come from the heart of Paul Rader. But Paul Rader doesn't get any credit, you see. And so if that's good enough for a man like Paul Rader, why should I worry about what people think about me? And why should I worry about my lasting impression when what I should be worried about is how can Christ impact your life through your encounter with me today? And I think that sums up Paul Rader's life, in my mind anyway. Of course, he's probably different things to different people, And it was the rough and tumble, wild and woolly West that sort of made him into the kind of man that he was. And it also created a personality for the 20s, the Roaring 20s, because the Roaring 20s, Dr. Simpson, for example, died in 1919. He was a great man and statesman before the turn of the century. Well, the Roaring 20s came along, and it blew America out of the water. And I think the West prepared Paul Rader to be an influence in the Roaring 20s. And that was a special time in our country. I mean, that was before the Great Depression, and that was right after World War I, the war that was going to end all wars, and there was a euphoric attitude in America that only a man who had gone through some of the things that Paul Rader went through could really understand that and interpret the gospel into that culture, into that mindset. And so I think all of this stuff made him and prepared him to be the kind of man that God needed during the Roaring 20s. But if you begin to read and study some of his sermons and writings, you will find that Paul Rader is quite an intellectual. He doesn't wear it on his sleeve, and he's really cowboy-ish in a lot of his presentations. But underneath it all, the bedrock of it is he's a very intellectual man, very well read. I mean, it's amazing. I'm reading some of his sermons, and Paul Rader was studying that. Paul Rader has knowledge of that. I mean, it's amazing the things that he knew. And he could talk, for example, he could carry on a very intelligent conversation with a university president and with a cowboy who is sitting around a campfire. He had no problem with that kind of a stretch. And that probably was a gift, I guess, that he has that ability to go back and forth. But a lot of intellectual people can't talk to the cowboy around the thing. And even if they did, the cowboy around the fire doesn't know what they're talking about, But Paul Rader could talk intellectually with a college president, university president, and he could talk intellectually with a cowboy around the fireplace. And he had the ability to communicate Christ to both extremes. And I don't find very many people that have that ability. So intellectual, I think he was a bedrock intellectual, but he never would do anything to put another brother down. You know, he would never show off his intelligence or his knowledge or anything. His goal for you and his relationship with you was when you left him, you felt better about yourself and you felt more committed to Jesus Christ. Nobody ever went away from Paul Rader thinking, wow, he's a great man. With Paul Rader, you never left him thinking that he was a marvelous man, but you always left him thinking, what a wonderful Christ we have. What a wonderful Savior we have. And that was the impact that Paul Rader had on people. And that's why people loved him, because he never upstaged anybody. He never put anybody down. He was never on the fundamental side. He was never on that side. He was right down the middle. And that's why some people hated him too. But that's why the common people heard him gladly, as somebody else that I've read about, you know. Well, Billy Sunday was a barnstormer. You know, I mean, hellfire and brimstone, and he had a lot of gymnastics. And you know, all of his stances and stuff like that. That was his stock and trade. Paul Rader's preaching was more dramatic, and that's why he was such a great radio preacher, because his preaching, it was stories, it was in his preaching, you had to use your imagination. He painted pictures and so forth. Whereas Billy Sunday was an actor, and he acted out his sermons. Well, you know, you can't do much acting like that on radio, you know. And so I think that the difference was simply in their way to present it. Paul Rader wasn't a shouter. I mean, Billy Sunday, I have records of Billy Sunday, and he shouts and yells and jumps and all that kind of stuff, which is good on the sawdust trail. But when you're on radio, I mean, it doesn't fly. And so Paul Rader's style, you see, he I think honed his style as a short story writer. That's not a very well-known fact about him, that he wrote short stories, and that was his basic training. That's what he aspired to be. And so in writing, you have to paint a picture. And I think that's why Rader became such a great radio preacher, because that was his style. And that's the thing that he used to grab the attention of people. He could make you see something. In fact, someone said that Paul Rader is the only person that they could find in history who had so many stories. He would use one story and illustrate it with another story, and he had all the balls in the air at the same time. And not very many people can do that. But he had the way of getting your attention and keeping your attention and pulling you right in. There was a dramatic effect, I think, to how he preached. And so I think that's why Billy Sunday didn't make it on radio. Billy Sunday probably could make it on television, you know, but not on radio. The number one motivating factor was this gospel of the kingdom must be preached in all the world, and then the end will come. Everything Rader did was in some way related to evangelism. Every story he told, every article he wrote, every broadcast, every project that came out of his heart had one aspect, and that was to introduce people to Jesus Christ. Even when he turned the tabernacle into a cabbage factory, you know, the underlying purpose was to reach these people in order to present Jesus Christ to them. I think that you can't understand Rader if you don't understand his heartbeat for evangelism. And that's why he couldn't sit well at Moody Church, and that's why he couldn't sit well as a denominational president, because nothing else mattered to him. Nothing else mattered to him but evangelism.